Looking at this picture of a still life, and I'm going to show you how to break it down in terms of simple shapes and forms, and I'm also going to show you how to measure height and width and how to get what's called an angular transfer. The first thing I did was try and figure out where things go. So I'm going to start with the largest item, which is the vase with the flowers. And I noticed that it is not center in the paper. If you look at that frame, it's off to the left. So I'm going to make sure I put mine there as well. I also noticed that the flowers aren't going off page. So I'm putting down what's called tick marks. These marks are indicating the height of the vase. And I like to use tick marks because they're not permanent and I can move them if need be. This is giving me a visual roadmap. So I'm getting the height, and in a moment I'm going to get the width. Now I am doing that for every object. So for the bell pepper, I'm getting the height, I'm getting the width, same for the apple. When I'm putting those down though, I'm checking where they are on the picture plane. So that means that I'm evaluating it. I'm going to show you. So you can envision a horizontal line at the bottom of that apple shape. And if I draw that horizontal line to the left, where does it hit on that bell pepper? So that tells me right there that the bell pepper is lower than the apple and it's in front. And I'm doing this to every shape. So I'm doing that to the picture too. I'm like, is the picture behind the apple? Is it farther back, or is it closer, or is it on the same tabletop plane? These marks are easy for me to make, and they're essentially cheap marks, which means I can move them and they don't really take that much effort. So there you're seeing me frame out in kind of a rectangular shape the picture. And again, I'm going to compare where the bottom of things hit against another object. So I'm looking at that cube and I ask myself, where is that bottom corner going to hit on the bell pepper? And then I look at the top of that cube and I'm like, where does that hit on the jar? So this is the whole idea of puzzling a composition together. This composition is complicated, and not so much that you can't do it, but you just have to compare one piece of the puzzle to another. As you're doing this, you want to think about the negative space. So that means that you're looking at the empty space in between objects like the cube. Compare it to the jar, and what is that shape? Same is going to be true of the pitcher. You know, you have that pitcher, and that's a difficult pitcher to pull off if you're not paying attention to the open space, empty space around it. Cubes can sometimes present a bit of a problem to beginning students because of their angles. You have to remind yourself that a cube is a parallelogram. So that means that there are corresponding parallel angles. But I am going to show you another way, a way that I use all the time. This is a technique called angular transfer. So you can see I'm taking my pencil right up to the angle of the object I want to match, and I just move it from that reference picture and I transfer it onto the paper. And I do that by extending my arm all the way. I lock it into place. So I physically lock my arm at that degree, that angle that I'm trying to transfer, and I move it over to my paper. Now you can see my paper, my reference picture is very close to my drawing, so it makes it even easier for me to do this angular transfer. I always double check my angles too. You can use this technique when you're working from a reference photo, but you can also easily use this when you're drawing from life. This is a great skill, and I do this all the time. In fact, if you watch the pro artists working, you'll see them angle their pencil or their brush to try and duplicate an angle onto their paper or onto their canvas. So the trick is just to make sure you lock your arm at that exact angle and then move it over. You can see how far back I'm holding that pencil. That actually helps because I drag my line down to try and capture that angle. So most of my drawings or paintings typically start out like this, a whole bunch of tick marks and what seems like random shapes, but this will quickly evolve into those specific forms. So that you have the cube, you have the cylinder taking shape here, and there's some organic forms with the flowers and the leaves. So this part goes relatively quickly because of that roadmap, and you want to just double check things like how tall is that jar in comparison to that cube, how tall is the pitcher in comparison to that jar of water, which one's taller. These are all things that you have to ask yourself as an artist when you're assembling a composition. So remember too the other day when we were working on geometric forms, these are all essentially geometric forms that we're working with here. And you've just got to work with each object, figure out the basic form, and envision that form in your head as you're drawing it. So you have to understand like a cylinder is going to be curved on the bottom. It's going to have what's called an ellipse at the top. An ellipse is a kind of a skinny oval. Here I just want you to notice the shape of the negative space, and I'm actually drawing onto the paper. I'm drawing a horizontal line connecting the teapot or that pitcher to that spout. So you can see where does that spout, how high to make that spout. So I'm just drawing it on here too. And then you do want to look at that negative shape around the spout. When I moved into doing the flower and the leaves, I switched my stroke. So instead of using hatch marks, I'm using more of a continuous line. So that's why I want to teach you continuous line, because I do use it on really organic freeform shapes like you're seeing here. It's just easier for me. You use what's best for you. You can see here that I'm putting in the cast shadows, so that's part of it as well. So I'd like you to go ahead and make sure you have every form shadow and cast shadow in place, and I do want you to label them. So I want you to do that so that I know that you understand the difference between a form shadow, which is the shadow on the object itself, and the cast shadow, which is the shadow that's falling onto the ground or that back wall. So you can see that's what I'm doing. There's a form and a cast, a form and a cast here. So I do want you to look at that reference picture really closely when you're describing these things and make sure that you're labeling. We're going to go ahead and stop at this stage. Next class will be watercoloring it in.